They called it Brannock's Folly, long before the first snow touched the roofs of the Missouri Headwater settlement in the winter of 1812. A dozen cabins dotted that raw stretch of frontier, their log walls already groaning under the bite of oncoming cold. But only one of them, Elias Brannock's cabin, had a strange bulge rising from its north wall, a hump of stone and packed earth that looked like a tumor growing out of the structure itself.
What is that?
The neighbors said it was madness. Some said grief had driven him to it. Others swore he was courting disaster in ways no sane man should. Elias barely looked up when they commented. Day after day, he shaped river stones with a small hammer, tapping until each piece fit like part of a puzzle only he understood. He packed the gaps with a clay and ash mortar that smoked faintly when warmed by sunlight. And behind that stone skin, hidden like the ribs of some ancient beast, was a narrow channel and air passage connected directly to the firebox of his wood stove. To anyone watching, it was nothing but a fool's errand. Who carved a hollow into the coldest wall of a cabin? Who invited winter in just to brick it up again with rocks scavenged from creek beds, and for what? A rumor spread that the old Scotsman had gone half wild after his wife died 3 winters prior. A man alone with too many thoughts and not enough good sense, someone said. Another joked that maybe Elias was building a tomb for himself, saving the weather the trouble of killing him. But what no one realized, not yet, not until the blizzards came down from the Bitterroots, was that Elias wasn't fighting cold with thicker walls. He was doing something much stranger, teaching the wall to hold heat. Not for minutes, but for hours. Long after the fire died, on the night his neighbors expected his broken wall to freeze him solid, Elias sat inside his cabin, with sleeves rolled up the air, comfortably warm, and the stone bulge beside him radiating steady heat like the flank of a living creature. It made no sense, not to them, but to Elias Brannock, son of a blacksmith student of forgotten masonry, this wasn't madness. It was physics, and winter was about to prove him right. Before the Missouri Headwaters knew him as the man with the strange wall, Elias Brannock had already lived 2 lives, one on the settled edges of New England, and one on the ragged frontier where a man's worth was measured in firewood and grit. He was born in 1765 in a Vermont valley where winters cut as deep as any in the Rockies. His father, Angus Brannock, a blacksmith from the Scottish Highlands, believed a boy's education started not with books, but with heat, watching it, feeling it, respecting the way it moved through metal, through brick, through air itself. By 16, Elias could read heat the way hunters tracked elk. He helped his father repair clay-lined kilns used by local potters, patching thermal faults, smoothing cracks where heat leaked out. He learned that heat was a living thing, restless, powerful, always searching for a way to escape. And if you wanted to survive the long northern winters, you didn't just burn more wood. You learned how to catch heat and trap it where you needed it most. Life should have unfolded quietly for him. A small homestead, a wife, a workshop, and for a few years it did. Elias married a school teacher named Margaret, a woman with warm hands and a laugh that could soften even the hardest of days. But in the winter of 1809, an early freeze swept through their valley. Margaret fell ill, the cabin stove burning day and night, but never enough to keep the cold from her lungs. She died in a room rimmed with frost, and Elias never forgave himself for not understanding heat well enough to save her. Grief drove him west, farther than most men dared travel. He wandered with trappers, worked as a smith at river outposts, slept under fir trees in snowstorms that should have claimed him. And everywhere he went, he studied how heat behaved, how stone held warmth, how clay slowed cooling, how air rose, sank, curled, and drifted like a living stream. By 1812, Elias was a man rebuilt, quiet, unassuming, but forged harder than the iron he once hammered. When he settled near the Missouri Headwaters, he carried with him an idea, half memory, half innovation, of a wall that didn't just separate indoors from out, but stored the warmth of the fire itself. The neighbors saw eccentricity. Elias saw redemption. For most settlers on the early frontier, a cabin was nothing more than a hurried compromise. 4 walls thrown up before the snow arrived, moss shoved between the cracks, and a single iron stove set in the center like a heart that could never beat fast enough. On paper, it seemed simple: build thick walls, burn good wood, keep the door shut. But anyone who survived a winter west of the Mississippi knew a bitter truth. These cabins bled heat like a wounded animal. Frontier logs were green when felled, still heavy with sap. As they dried over months or years, they shrank and twisted, opening long, sucking gaps that the wind exploited mercilessly. The roof board, split by hand, rarely fit tight. And the floor, if a man had one at all, was nothing more than packed dirt that held cold like a cellar. No matter how fiercely a stove roared, the heat was pulled upward, pressed against the low ceiling, then stripped away through the walls faster than a man could replenish wood. But the worst offender was always the north wall. That side of a cabin facing the prevailing winter winds was a highway for cold. Wind slid along it, pooled against it, pressed into it, until the interior logs themselves became cold sinks. A settler might stack extra hides or nail old canvas to the inside, but it was like wrapping a wolf in cotton. It still had teeth. Back east, where winters were softer and homes closer together, people talked of keeping houses tight. Out here, the frontier laughed at such ideas. Cold wasn't a season, it was a living adversary. It reached through every gap, stole warmth from every surface, dragged heat upward and out the chimney before a family ever felt it. Men worked double shifts just hunting firewood. Women cooked meals beside stoves that blasted heat outward, only to have it vanish as if stolen by invisible hands. Children slept two to a bed, wrapped in quilts that frosted over by morning. The community near the Missouri headwaters was no exception. Their cabins creaked, groaned, and chilled to the bone the minute the fire dimmed. So when Elias Brannock carved a deliberate hollow into his north wall, a wall already too thin, too cold, too vulnerable, his neighbors didn't just think he was misguided. They thought he was inviting the winter in, and in a way, he was. But he intended to send it back out and changed. Elias began the project in late September, when the cottonwoods along the Missouri had just turned gold, and the river carried the first taste of winter in its breath. He worked slowly, methodically, like a man following instructions written in memory. First, he stripped the interior surface of the north wall down to bare logs. Then, instead of adding insulation, like any reasonable settler, he carved inward chiseling, scooping, hollowing out a pocket nearly 3 feet deep. That was when the neighbors started whispering. Into that recess, he laid the first stones, river-rounded pieces selected not for shape, but for density, the kind that held the sun's warmth longer than others. He tapped each stone with a blacksmith's rhythm, listening for the dull, solid tone that meant it would store heat well. Around them, he pressed a mortar of clay charcoal dust and sifted ash, a mixture his father once used to line kilns so they wouldn't crack under sudden heat. But the heart of the design was the narrow air channel snaking behind the stones. Elias built it by placing fist-sized rocks in a staggered pattern, leaving a tight passage that connected directly to a handmade iron throat bolted behind his stove's firebox. When the stove burned, hot air would rise through that hidden channel, warming the stones before slipping out again near the stove's chimney base. A closed loop. No moving parts, nothing fancy, but potentially revolutionary if it didn't burn his cabin down. From outside, the structure bulged like a misplaced hearthstone pushing through the wall. Children joked it looked like a hibernating bear stuck halfway into the cabin. Men shook their heads and muttered about wasted time. One settler, an older man named Hollis Graves, warned Elias straight out, "Stone heat's uneven. clay cracks. You're building yourself a bomb, friend. Elias only nodded and kept working. When he sealed the final layers, smoothing the clay with a wet hand, until the whole mass looked like one continuous slab, he stepped back and surveyed it. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't meant to be. It was a vessel, a heat vault, a place for fire to leave its memory. And on the first night of October, as the settlement braced for the cold ahead, Elias packed kindling into his stove, lit it, and prepared to prove whether the stupid wall trick was folly or frontier genius waiting to wake. The night Elias chose for the first test was one no sensible man would have picked. A cold front had dropped out of the bitter roots, faster than anyone expected, carrying the kind of wind that made shutters rattle like loose teeth. The settlement hunkered down early fires, stoked high doors barred against the chill. But in Elias Brannock's cabin, a different kind of fire was being prepared, one that would decide whether he lived through the winter or burned in his own experiment. He started small. No roaring blaze, no bravado. Just a careful stack of cedar kindling a handful of dry willow twigs and one split log of cottonwood placed with the precision of a man laying a keystone. When the match caught, soft flames licked at the firebox, sending the first curls of heated air up into the hidden throat behind the stove and into the stone vault buried in the north wall. For the first half hour, nothing happened. The cabin remained cold enough to see his breath. The wall looked as lifeless as ever. Outside wind clawed at the chinking, and the neighbors, some watching through frosted windows, waited for smoke to belch from the wrong place, for stone to crack, for panic to spill out the cabin door. Then something changed. Elias placed his palm against the stone bulge. It was no longer cold. It wasn't warm yet, but awake. A low rising heat pulsed beneath the clay skin. Another half hour passed, and the wall began to exhale. Warmth, slow, steady, the kind that seeped into the bones instead of blasting the air. By the time he added the second log, the entire structure radiated like a sunken hearthstone. Outside, 3 men finally approached, led by Hollis Graves. They opened the cabin door, expecting smoke chaos, maybe even a frantic Elias trying to plug a burst seam. Instead, they found him seated at his small table, sleeves rolled up, sipping a tin mug of tea as though winter weren't clawing at the walls. The air inside was warm, comfortably warm, not from the stove alone, but from the massive stone vault glowing gently behind him. Hollis touched the wall, jerking his hand back, not from pain, but surprise. The surface was hot, but not dangerous. Controlled, balanced, impossible. No one spoke for a long moment. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the wall held its ground, steady, patient, radiating heat, long after the fire began to die. The folly was working. Word spread quickly that Elias Brannock's lumpy wall hadn't blown up, caved in, or frozen over. It had done something far stranger. It stayed warm hours after the fire dwindled to nothing more than a red thread glow. That baffled the settlement. Most frontier folks understood wood, wind, and winter well enough. But heat was invisible, mysterious, a thing you felt, not something you studied. Elias understood it differently. The secret lay in what he'd built, not a wall, but a battery, a thermal vault capable of soaking up heat and releasing it slowly, predictably, like a stone lung-breathing warmth long after the fire slept. The idea wasn't entirely new. In Europe, stone masonry heaters had been used for centuries. Finnish stoves, Russian brick ovens, Scottish black houses all relied on the same principle: heat stone, not air. Air forgets. Stone remembers. Frontier cabins, however, were built fast, light, and cheap. Nobody hauled hundreds of pounds of river rock into their walls. Nobody carved channels for rising air. Nobody had the patience for a system designed to work over hours, not minutes. Comfort had to be instant blast, the stove stand close, endure the cold the moment you stepped away. But Elias, trained by a blacksmith father who spent half his life tending fires, knew that heat isn't something you chase. It's something you trap. The stones he chose weren't random. Dense river rocks hold heat far longer than split logs or clay chinking. The clay ash mortar he used hardened into a ceramic-like shell that distributed warmth evenly instead of creating hot spots that cracked. And the narrow air channel behind the stones. It was a passive heat exchanger, a simple but brilliant pathway where rising hot air from the stove dumped its energy into the vault before being released near the chimney base. No pumps, no valves, no moving parts, just physics older than the frontier itself. As the firebox heated, warm air spiraled through the hidden tunnel. The stone mass drank in that heat greedily, its temperature climbing steadily. When the fire died, the stones reversed the flow, releasing stored heat back into the cabin hour by hour, like a silent servant working through the night. Where other cabins plunged into freezing darkness, the moment a flame went out, Elias's stayed warm enough to feel lived in, civilized almost. It wasn't magic. It wasn't madness. It was knowledge the frontier had forgotten. Winter didn't ease into the Missouri headwaters that year. It struck like a hammer. By late November, the river froze at the edges. The elk herds moved downslope early, and the settlement woke each morning to windows rimed in white lace. Men burned through their woodpiles twice as fast as they'd planned. Women stuffed blankets into the cracks between logs. Children slept in their boots. It was the kind of winter the old trappers warned about, the kind that tested every choice a man had made since autumn, and it tested Elias Brannock's wall. The cold came first, as a creeping chill, then as a brute force that punched through every cabin in the small community, every cabin except his. Neighbors found frost forming on the inside of their walls, thin sheets of ice blooming like ghostly ferns. The moment of fire-dimmed rooms dropped into the 20s. Food froze solid in root cellars that should have been insulated enough to stay cool, not frigid. But in Elias's cabin, something remarkable happened. Even after he let the fire burn low each night, too low by anyone else's measure, the temperature inside stayed steady. Not warm like spring, but warm enough that breath didn't fog. Warm enough to sleep without fear of waking numb-fingered or frostbitten. Warm enough that one night, when the mercury outside plunged to 20 below, Elias's cabin held at 29 degrees warmer than any other home in the settlement. The news spread faster than any rumor they'd ever traded. At first, the neighbors tried to rationalize it. Maybe Elias had stacked extra furs. Maybe he burned some special hardwood. Maybe he sat awake all night, feeding the stove. But when Hollis Graves and his brother Samuel visited during a cold snap and stepped inside, they froze, astonished, not chilled. Elias's stove was barely smoldering. Yet the room breathed heat like a creature alive. The great stone vault along the north wall glowed softly, warmth radiating from its mass long after the fire had fallen into embers. Children came next, then mothers, then husbands, desperate for answers. One by one they touched the stone, marveling at the gentle steadiness of its warmth. Warm, patient, reliable in a way no frontier stove had ever been. That winter broke many things across the settlement: tools, livestock, tempers, spirits. But it proved one thing beyond doubt. Elias Brannock's strange wall wasn't madness. It was survival perfected. By mid-January, even the proudest men in the settlement could no longer pretend Elias's wall was a curiosity or a fluke. Too many nights had passed with temperatures so brutal that water buckets froze solid by morning, so cold that leather boots stiffened like boards, so cold that two families nearly lost infants to the night air, drifting through their own log seams. Survival has a way of stripping away pride, and that winter pride froze faster than creek water. The shift began quietly. First came Hollis Graves, the loudest critic of Elias's mad wall. He arrived one morning in a blizzard, knocking snow from his hat, eyes weary. "Elias," he said, voice cracking, more than he intended. I need to know what you did. Elias didn't gloat, didn't tease, didn't even smile. He simply motioned the man inside, poured him a cup of hot water fresh from a kettle kept warm by the wall's radiance, and began explaining. Word traveled. Soon Samuel Graves, then the widow, Elspeth Turner, with her 3 small children, and then a young trapper named Reed, now coughing from nights spent in a freezing bunk. They came not as skeptics anymore, but as students. Some brought notebooks, others brought tools. A few brought nothing but cold fingers and humility. Elias gathered them inside his cabin one evening, the stone vault humming with stored heat like a slow heartbeat. He taught them the basics first, how dense stone holds heat better than air, how clay mixed with ash creates a mortar that doesn't crack when heated, how narrow channels encourage warm air to rise and circulate. Then he taught them the part that surprised them most: patience. Frontier people were accustomed to quick fixes, to chopping wood and building fires that blazed bright and fast. Elias's system required the opposite: gradual, steady heating, a fire tended with care instead of urgency. Some men understood immediately. Others struggled, confused by the idea that heat could be shaped like metal or guided like water. But all of them felt the truth each time they leaned against Elias's wall and felt its deep, unwavering warmth. By February, the mockery had vanished. In its place grew a quiet respect, almost reverence, for the man they'd once dismissed as grief-struck and half-broken. Elias Brannock hadn't just built a wall. He'd built a classroom in the heart of winter. When the first hints of spring began teasing the valley, thin sunlight, a slight softening of the snow crust, the trickle of meltwater under river ice, the settlement carried scars from the winter of 1812. Frost-nipped fingers, a couple of weakened livestock. One cabin abandoned after its owner fell ill from weeks spent shivering through the nights. But amid the hardship, something unexpected had taken root: an idea. It started with 3 families who refused to face another winter as unprepared as the last. They gathered stone from the riverbanks, just as Elias had taught, testing each piece by tapping it with a hatchet, listening for the dense, solid tone that meant good thermal mass. Others followed, unsure if they were building a wall of furnace or simply mimicking something they didn't yet understand. By mid-April, half the settlement was experimenting with stone pockets and clay mixtures, some crude, some ambitious, some laughably strange. But even the worst attempts worked better than bare log walls. Elias didn't build the new vaults himself. He insisted people learn, not copy. He walked from cabin to cabin offering advice, never commanding, always suggesting. "Your stones are too small," he'd say gently, or "widen the throat. Air needs a path." He corrected dangerous designs, praised clever ones, and spent evenings drawing rough diagrams with charcoal on pine planks. Word drifted beyond the settlement. Trappers stopping at trading posts spoke of the man with the warm wall, and by early summer, 2 cabins at the Three Forks outpost began their own versions. A preacher from Fort Henry visited, curious whether such a system could warm a small meeting hall with fewer cords of wood. Even a company surveyor made notes, intrigued by a passive system that didn't require imported materials. That autumn, as the second winter approached, the settlement looked different. Instead of plain cabins, many now bore stone bulges along their north walls, each one a quiet gamble against the season ahead. Not all were well built. Some cracked. Some never warmed fully. Some smoked badly because the air channels were misaligned. But the best ones, they worked beautifully modest, glowing hearths that released heat steadily through the night. What began as a single man's grief-shaped innovation had become a frontier movement. Not organized, not formal, but deeply human. A community learning to shape heat, to tame winter, to think like Elias. For a few bright years, Elias Brannock's heat vault walls felt like the beginning of something permanent, a shift in how the frontier fought winter. Through the mid-1810s, new cabins rose with river stone bulges woven into their north faces. Travelers spoke of warm walls at the Missouri headwaters the way one might speak of a new tool or a clever trap. Families who once froze through long nights now slept easier. The settlement burned less wood, coughed less smoke, and faced winter with steadier courage. And yet quietly, inevitably, the movement began to thin. The first reason was simple labor. A proper thermal vault required days, sometimes weeks, of stone gathering clay, mixing, layering, curing. Most frontier families lived by the rhythm of necessity, not craft. They needed cabins fast, repairs faster. A stone heat battery was a luxury of time, and time was the one thing most settlers lacked. The second reason was complexity. Elias made the principle sound simple: dense stones rising air-stored heat, but execution demanded finesse. If a masonry seam wasn't packed tight enough, the vault leaked smoke. If the air channel dipped too low, circulation failed. If the clay mix was too wet, the vault cracked under sudden heat. Many settlers tried, but not all succeeded. A few vaults worked brilliantly. Others were awkward lumps that warmed unevenly or failed altogether. The frontier tolerated risk, but not uncertainty. Then came technology. By the early 1820s, cast iron stoves grew cheaper as river routes opened and trade expanded. Blacksmiths could repair them easily. Storehouses could order replacements. A stove offered instant gratification, fast heat, bright flame, predictable performance. Compared to that, a slow-warming stone vault seemed outdated, even though it used half the wood. And finally, there was migration. Families moved westward, leaving cabins behind. Newcomers built quickly, cared little for inherited stonework, and often tore vaults out entirely to make room for larger stoves or new layouts. The knowledge Elias taught was passed by hand and voice, not by books. And on the frontier, voices fade as surely as footprints. By 1830, only a handful of heat vault walls remained. Most settlers remembered them as an odd experiment, useful, yes, but inconvenient in a world that valued speed over subtlety. But in the cabin where the first one stood, Elias's own, the wall endured, still holding the gentle warmth of an idea the frontier wasn't quite ready to keep. The heat vault might have slipped into obscurity entirely, if not for the strange rhythm of American history, how ideas disappear when they're no longer needed, then reappear when the world grows hungry for them again. For more than a century after Elias Brannock built his stone-filled north wall, the frontier marched westward. Cabins gave way to clapboard houses, and iron stoves were replaced by coal furnaces, oil heaters. And finally, the whisper of electric coils humming behind thermostats. Comfort became easy. Heat became something purchased, not fought for. And the old ways, the slow ways, the clever ways, born from hardship, faded from memory. But clever ideas have a habit of resurfacing when times grow lean. During the energy crises of the 1970s, when fuel prices soared and winters once again pressed heavy on rural households, a small group of homesteaders, off-grid dreamers, and back-to-the-land natural builders began digging through forgotten knowledge. They read obscure diaries, frontier newspapers, farm journals, anything that hinted at how earlier generations stayed warm without dependence on fuel. Among the rediscovered technologies were Russian masonry ovens, Scandinavian heat benches, and a handful of vague references to warm walls in the Missouri Territory around the winter of 1812. A young architecture student at the University of Montana even wrote a thesis on a passive thermal mass after stumbling upon a second-hand account of a stone-lined cavity built into a north wall by a Scotsman who believed heat should be stored, not chased. The description wasn't detailed enough to rebuild the design outright, but the principles were unmistakable. More importantly, they were timeless. Others drew parallels. Rocket mass heaters with their slow, stone-soaked radiant warmth. Passive solar walls that trap heat behind masonry skins. modern hydronic systems that circulate hot water through dense floors. All of them rediscovered what Elias knew instinctively, that heat is a resource best captured gradually and released slowly. Today, whether because of rising energy costs, unstable grids, harsher winters, or a cultural shift toward simplicity, people are once again searching for solutions that do not rely on electricity, fragile supply chains, or endless fuel. In that search, Elias's vanished insight suddenly feels not archaic, but prophetic. Sometimes the future bends back toward the past, toward the wisdom of people who lived close to the earth, close to their fires, close to the truths that comfort isn't purchased. It's built. Elias Brannock never cared for praise. If anything, he seemed slightly embarrassed when people thanked him. He would nod, wipe his hands on his buckskin trousers, and mutter something about just doing what made sense. But those who knew him understood the heat vault wall was more than a clever trick. It was the culmination of everything he had lived through his upbringing in the cold valleys of Vermont. The years spent learning with his blacksmith father, the heartbreak of losing Margaret, and the long wandering journey westward, where he studied fire the way others studied scripture. Through the 1810s and well into the 1820s, Elias remained a quiet mentor in the Missouri headwaters. Young men apprenticed under him, informally absorbing not just technique, but temperament. He taught patience over panic, observation over assumption. Heat tells you what it wants to do, he'd often say. Most folks don't listen. You must listen. Some settlers adopted the phrase as a kind of proverb. He was not wealthy. He lived in the same one-room cabin for decades, patching the roof each spring, tending a modest garden, trading ironwork for flour or candles. He hunted just enough to keep through winter. But despite his modest life, he was never alone. Travelers stopped by just to warm themselves at the famous wall. Children brought him questions about the natural world. Widows brought small gifts at Christmas out of gratitude for his help during the terrible winter of 12. In 1841, at the age of 76, Elias's health began to fail. The doctor from Fort Henry suggested he move closer to family. He had a sister in St. Louis willing to take him in. Reluctantly, Elias agreed. Before leaving, he spent one last afternoon running his hands over the stones of his heat vault wall. A neighbor later recalled seeing him standing there in silent reflection, palm pressed to the clay's surface, as though greeting an old friend. He died the following spring, buried on a hillside overlooking the river he had crossed so many times. His cabin passed through several owners afterward. Some kept the wall, some modified it. One family decades later discovered a small wooden box tucked beneath a floorboard. Inside were sketches, rough but clear, showing cross-sections of the original vault notes on airflow. A simple message on the last page: heat moves. Let it teach you. It was the closest thing Elias Brannock ever left to a will, and perhaps the richest legacy a frontier craftsman could offer. If you strip away the stone, the clay, the cold winters, and the raw edges of frontier life, what Elias Brannock left behind wasn't a wall at all. It was a philosophy, a way of looking at the world that feels strangely relevant again, especially in a time when modern comforts often disguise how vulnerable we really are. As the decades passed and his cabin weathered into history, people who studied his design realized that the genius of it wasn't merely technical. It was philosophical. Lesson 1. Waste is opportunity. Most folks saw their chimney as an exhaust pipe, something that let the smoke escape. Elias saw it as a river of unused energy. Where others saw loss, he saw potential. Today we live in a world that throws away staggering amounts of heat, water, electricity, labor, because we assume abundance. Elias's thinking reminds us that efficiency begins with respect for what we already have. Lesson 2. Simplicity is strength. His system had no valves to fail, no gears to jam, no pumps to burn out. It relied solely on physics, older than civilization, hot air rises, stone stores, heat-cold sinks. In an age increasingly dependent on fragile, complex technology, the strength of a passive system, one that just works, is a lesson worth rediscovering. Lesson 3. Mockery is not analysis. Elias faced ridicule not because his idea was flawed, but because it was unfamiliar. The frontier often valued conformity over curiosity, and that hasn't changed much. New ideas still suffer the weight of old assumptions. His story is a reminder to examine before dismissing, to measure before mocking. Lesson 4. Cross-discipline knowledge creates breakthroughs. Elias blended the blacksmith's understanding of heat, the potter's knowledge of clay, and the trapper's awareness of climate. Innovation rarely comes from a single field. It happens where worlds collide. Modern engineers, homesteaders, and builders could gain much from embracing that intersection. Lesson 5. Teach what you know. Elias never charged coin for his knowledge. He taught because he believed survival was a shared responsibility. That mindset transformed a single cabin into dozens, and hardship into resilience. In a world where knowledge is often gated behind paywalls, degrees, and institutions, his generosity stands as a quiet challenge. The deeper truth is this: frontier engineering wasn't merely about survival. It was about harmony, understanding the land, the seasons, the materials, and the fire itself. Elias believed the world whispered instructions, if you listened carefully enough. And for those willing to listen, his lessons still speak today. On the last night, Elias Brannock spent in his cabin long before his journey east, and the quiet grave that would claim his story, he sat beside the heat vault wall in the silence only the frontier can make. Outside, the wind combed through the cottonwoods in long, low sighs. Snowflakes drifted against the window pane and melted before they could cling. And inside that old stone bulge glowed warm and steady the fire within it, long since gone to embers. Elias didn't speak aloud, and there was no one there to hear, but the warmth against his palm told him everything he needed to know. The wall worked. The idea worked. More than that, it had served its purpose. It had saved lives, softened winters, and given families a fighting chance against a landscape that offered no mercy. It had turned cold nights into bearable ones, and bearable nights into something like comfort. The frontier was full of inventions like that, quiet, homemade, built not for glory, but for survival. Most were forgotten, swallowed by progress, or buried under new technologies. But each one held a kind of wisdom that modern eyes rarely see: the belief that a person could shape their world, even with limited tools, if they listened closely enough to the materials in their hands. If you stand today in a cold cabin off-grid, miles from the nearest line of poles or the hum of a modern furnace, you might imagine Elias rising before dawn, lighting only a small fire, trusting that the stones would remember their lessons from the night before. You might imagine him stepping outside to a world rimmed in frost, while behind him his humble wall breathed out slow, patient heat. And if you listen, truly listen, you may hear the message he left behind, tucked into the margins of sketches and murmured to a few apprentices who bothered to pay attention. Fire is brief, warmth is built. In a world still learning how to live within its means, how to waste less, how to endure more, the frontier offers a reminder. Comfort doesn't have to be complicated. Survival doesn't need to be extravagant. Sometimes the difference between a bitter winter and a bearable one comes down to a simple truth: not how fiercely you burn the fire, but how wisely you hold its heat.